Democratic National Convention begins on August 19th in Chicago. Shortly after that date, the Biden-Harris ticket is set to formally accept the nomination as a Democratic ticket in 2024. But should Biden step aside, any potential nominee would have to win a majority of the delegates that he's already won in order to be the nominee. The nearly 4,000 delegates that he's won would be free to select another nominee. In this unlikely scenario of an open convention, there would likely be multiple candidates who would throw their hat in the ring to secure the Democratic nomination. No one has indicated that they're interested in such a move.
I would never turn my back on President Biden.
Joe Biden is our nominee. He's a good man. We trust him. We're behind him.
Representative Jim Clyburn of South Carolina is one of President Biden's strongest legislative allies. However, should Biden step aside, Clyburn indicated that he will support a mini primary, and he indicated that that form would likely boost Vice President Kamala Harris. In the past, a president has stepped aside before the party's convention. In 1968, President Lyndon B. Johnson was weighed down by the Vietnam War, and he declined to run for re-election as a Democratic nominee. Instead, Hubert Humphrey was a Democratic nominee, but he lost the election to Richard Nixon after deep Democratic divisions. This scenario remains unlikely, mostly because President Joe Biden has really dug in and said that he's committed to running for re-election.
There's been a lot of speculation. What's Joe going to do? Is he going to stay in the race? Is he going to drop out? What's he going to do? Well, here's my answer. I am running and going to win again.
On ABC News, Biden told host George Stephanopoulos that he was committed to the race and that he wasn't leaving.
I don't think anybody's more qualified to be president or win this race than me.
And recently, he sent a letter to House Democrats where he said that he was a nominee and that he wasn't going to leave the race. Should President Biden step aside voluntarily, it could wake up an electorate where a lot of voters were disenchanted with the choices, but it could also frustrate many of Biden's allies who wanted him to run for re-election. Another scenario is President Biden being challenged for the nomination, but at this point, it would likely happen at the convention. A range of donors are frustrated by President Biden's debate performance, and they're also unsure of whether or not he'll be able to serve effectively for another 4 years. This has caused a huge fervor within the party.
Is everybody behind the president?
It's a family discussion. I'm not going to say anymore.
Biden all the way. Yes. Joe Biden.
Yes.
And some are saying that somebody should step up to challenge President Biden at the convention. However, so far, no one has done so. It's unclear who would actually challenge President Biden at a Democratic convention, but it wouldn't be Vice President Kamala Harris, as she's on the ticket and she's been one of Biden's strongest allies. Democratic National Committee rules advocate for, but don't mandate that delegates select the nominee that a particular state voted for. But party delegates generally don't diverge from the state results. President Biden overwhelmingly won nearly 4,000 delegates in the past election. A particular nominee coming along would basically have to flip the vast majority of those delegates in order to win. That's something that would be highly unlikely given that most delegates are party loyalists. In the past, favorites to win nominations have been challenged by other candidates. In 1976, Ronald Reagan challenged Gerald Ford.
On one side of the street, Gerald Ford's headquarters, and on the other side of the street, Ronald Reagan's.
And although Reagan came up short, Ford ended up losing the election to Jimmy Carter. In 1980, Jimmy Carter was challenged by then Senator Ted Kennedy.
I didn't ask for a challenger, but have no aversion to a campaign.
Even though Kennedy lost, it basically divided Democrats, and Carter ended up losing the general election to Ronald Reagan that year. Generally, intra-party challenges at the convention have weakened the party, as they did in 1976 with Republicans and as they did in 1980 with the Democratic Party. At the moment, it remains unlikely that a Democratic candidate will step up to challenge Biden, but it could potentially still happen. Also, by mid to late August, sentiment against Biden would have to change drastically for a challenger to even have a chance unseating Biden. A Democratic challenger to Biden would mostly be concerned about down-ballot races, saying that Biden would weigh down House and Senate candidates. However, Biden has said that elites are trying to push him out of the party, and that could cause voters to rally to his side. In another scenario, President Biden would step aside as the Democratic nominee after the Democratic National Convention. There is no modern precedent for a presidential nominee stepping aside as a nominee after the convention. If that were to happen for Democrats, then the Democratic National Committee, in consultation with Democratic members of Congress and the Democratic Governors Association, would select a new nominee. One drawback of the DNC selecting the nominee is that it wouldn't be reflective of the Democratic primary electorate. A lot of people would say that it doesn't reflect the will of the voters. There are some issues that could arise if Biden steps aside as a nominee after the convention. The party would be running against some pretty strict ballot deadlines. So even if Biden wasn't the nominee, he could still be listed as the top of the ticket on ballots. Also, that particular nominee wouldn't have a lot of time to campaign. It would just be a matter of weeks before the general election. But we do have to note that the Democratic National Committee can tweak their rules. So a lot of these things aren't set in stone. There could be something that could be implemented, and that's where the nature of the race could take a new turn. If President Biden were to withdraw from the race, it would be something that hasn't happened in modern politics in a long time. Former President Donald Trump and Republicans are banking on President Biden being the Democratic nominee.
Meanwhile, the radical left Democrat Party is divided in chaos and having a full-scale breakdown, all because they can't decide which of their candidates is more unfit to be president, sleepy, crooked Joe Biden or laughing Kamala.
But should he not be the nominee, they would have to recalibrate how they approach the election in running against another nominee. There are also some serious financial implications, as presidential candidates have to raise lots of money to be competitive in those races. Should Vice President Kamala Harris be the Democratic presidential nominee, she would have access to the funds that were raised in both the primary and the general election. As of the end of June, the Biden-Harris ticket has about $240 million cash on hand. However, if Vice President Harris remains the vice presidential nominee, the Federal Election Commission would have to decide whoever emerges as the Democratic nominee if they would have access to the funds that the Biden-Harris ticket had raised. But if neither Biden or Harris are on the ticket, the new nominees would have to raise money from scratch. Right now, President Biden remains firmly committed to his re-election bid, and he says he's staying in the race. So most of these scenarios still appear to be highly unlikely. But Democrats on Capitol Hill remain pretty divided over the fate of his re-election campaign. Some feel as though he can win in the fall, and some of them still have concerns and questions about whether or not he can wage a successful campaign against former President Donald Trump.